Okay, so I'm very excited to be here tonight to talk to you about arrhythmias and racehorses, which is one of my real passions. And tonight I'll give you an overview of some of the more common arrhythmias that we see in horses and talk to you about what's involved in a cardiac workup. And then I'm going to focus on the research that I'm in the process of performing with the goal of reducing arrhythmia-associated deaths in both racehorses and in humans. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of some of the most important cardiac arrhythmias in horses. And before we start, I really just want to give a tribute to the horse. Horses are truly amazing athletes. And even though their resting heart rates are relatively similar to that of human athletes, their cardiac output and aerobic capacity is 5 times that of even the most elite human sprinter. So they really are truly amazing athletes. And with that, structural abnormalities that we see in some of our small animal patients are actually pretty uncommon in horses. So things like dilated cardiomyopathy that we might see in a Doberman or hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that we might see in cats are really very rare in horses. And even degenerative valvular disease that we see in small dogs is also not very common in horses. However, arrhythmias are surprisingly common. And this is where the heart beats in an irregular fashion. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So the heartbeat should be in a regular pattern, and this is controlled by electrical impulses that follow a very specific pathway. And we can measure that electrical activity using an electrocardiogram or an ECG, or you may have heard it called an EKG. And this is an example of an ECG complex. So each of the electrical waves is assigned a letter from P to T. And the P wave represents depolarization of the atria. So the electrical waveform spreads from the sinoatrial node and across the atria. And then the QRS complex, which is almost always the tallest complex, represents the spread of the waveform around and across the ventricles and ventricular depolarization. And then finally, the T wave is reflective of repolarization of the ventricles. And this happens in a very regular pattern at a regular rhythm. And so this would be a sign what would happen in a sinus rhythm ECG. And it's possible to perform an ECG using several different devices, but the televet, which is pictured here, is one of the most common, and it's certainly the one that we use for our research. So this little box here connects to a laptop or an iPad using Bluetooth. And these leads connect from the box to the horse with 2 electrodes on the right-hand side and then 2 electrodes on the left-hand side, as shown here. And this is what we're looking for in an ECG. So this is zoomed out from our previous slide. And you can see here that the QRS complexes, which, as I mentioned, are these big peaks and troughs, are very evenly spaced apart. And we call this the RR interval. And this is an example of a regular rhythm or a normal sinus rhythm ECG in a horse. In comparison, an arrhythmia is a disruption in the normal electrical pathway of the heart. So instead of that nice regular electrical flow, electrical activity starts in or follows in an abnormal path. And you can see in this ECG that the RR interval between these two beats is slightly shorter than the RR interval between these two complexes. And even if you can't see that, you can see that the RR interval between these 4 complexes is very different. And when you look at the ECG overall, this would be classified as an irregular rhythm or an arrhythmia. So when we think about what causes arrhythmias, there are primary arrhythmias, which are those that are caused by physiologic mechanisms, or those without an apparent cause, lone or idiopathic arrhythmias. And then there are arrhythmias that happen secondary to something else that's going on. So these are usually underlying diseases that lead to alterations in the electrical pathway. And that may be due to structural heart disease leading to enlargement of the heart. or they lead to alterations in the concentration of ions in the body. And we can see that in horses with a severe colic, or even in horses immediately post-colic surgery. And all of these predispose to the horse developing arrhythmias. And obviously today I don't have time to talk about all of them. And so I'm going to focus on the physiologic and lone or idiopathic arrhythmias. So by far the most important and common physiologic arrhythmia is second-degree atrioventricular block. And this is described as being an irregular rhythm. An example of that is seen in this ECG at the bottom here. So the RR interval between these two complexes and these two complexes is about the same. Similarly, the one over here is about the same as well. But this one in the middle is much longer. And actually, if you take a little step back and look at it, you can see that this RR interval is approximately double that of the preceding or following RR intervals. And what's really interesting is if you look here, you can actually see that there's a little P wave there. However, there isn't a following QRS complex. And that's because the P wave is blocked, so it doesn't get sent down into the ventricles. And this is most likely due to high vagal tone, which is completely normal in horses. And this is a physiologic arrhythmia, and it should go away with exercise. So if your horse has this, quite often your vet will jog the horse for a couple of laps and then listen to their heart again, just to check that it goes away, because if it stays with excitement and exercise, then that may be a bit more concerning. And then the lone arrhythmias are challenging because they occur in horses with structurally normal hearts. And so they're very difficult to diagnose, and the underlying cause is not well understood at this time. They're also very hard to pick up because they're very frequently very short-lived. So the horse might go in and out of an arrhythmia several times when the horse isn't even being listened to and it's not being picked up. And really, you need to be in the right place at the right time to identify a lot of these arrhythmias. And they range from single complexes that are premature all the way through sustained arrhythmias, which I'll talk about over the next few slides. So when we're looking at single premature complexes, we can see here this is an ECG, and the RR interval here is shorter than the preceding one. And so this is a premature beat. But when you look at the morphology, or what the shape of the ECG complex looks like, this looks just like all of the other beats in the ECG. And this would be an example of a supraventricular premature complex. So it's originating somewhere above the atrioventricular node. And then when we look here again, we can see that this RR interval is shorter than the preceding one. But this time when we look at the complex, this one is both wider and taller than the other complexes here, which are normal. And this is a ventricular premature complex, and it comes somewhere from the ventricles. And then we start to get into more complicated types of arrhythmia. So this is bigeminy, and this is where every other beat is abnormal. So we can see ventricular premature complexes interspersed between normal complexes that would be expected. And then couplets is where we have two premature complexes in a row, and triplets is where we have three premature complexes in a row. And then finally, as we move towards a more prolonged arrhythmia, we see these sustained arrhythmias, which are multiple abnormal complexes in a row. And this one's pretty interesting because we've actually caught it at the start of the arrhythmia. So you can't see the preceding beat, but this is a nice normal P, QRS, and T complex. And then it looks like we maybe have a P wave here, but then we get some form of trigger, and all of a sudden we have these wide and bizarre complexes with a very short RR interval. And so the heart rate is much higher here than it is here. And this is an example of ventricular tachycardia. But what's really interesting is that all of these ECGs were identified in fit and healthy racehorses without any history of cardiac issues. And in fact, we even followed up with this horse and one of the preceding horses that had the triplets, and the horses was actually racing and exceeding its expected performance. And so this is one of the challenges with these arrhythmias, is knowing what the consequence of them are. And then finally, atrial fibrillation is another sustained arrhythmia, and it's probably the most common arrhythmia that we know causes problems in horses. So this ECG shows an irregular pattern. And so all of these RR intervals are different. And in fact, if you measured all the RR intervals across this ECG, almost all of them would be different. And this one's relatively characteristic when you listen to it as well with your stethoscope. And it's described as having dryers and dry balls in a tumble dryer. It's really irregular and very scattered pattern. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, the clinical consequence of some of these arrhythmias is not known. So remarkably, a very high proportion, almost 50% of healthy racehorses develop some form of arrhythmia at exercise. And this may only be a single complex, so almost half some form of supraventricular complex, about a third a ventricular complex. But here we have somewhere between 16 and 25 of completely healthy racehorses with no problems have some form of complex arrhythmia. And these arrhythmias, as I showed you here, the ventricular tachycardia, are associated with sudden cardiac death in humans. But we see it in almost a quarter of our apparently healthy horses. But then one point to note is the very low frequency of atrial fibrillation in healthy horses. So when we look at horses with poor performance, the frequency of arrhythmias is slightly higher. So over half of racehorses with poor performance develop arrhythmias at exercise, with almost 3/4 developing supraventricular and about half developing ventricular arrhythmias. But what I really want you to take from this slide is there's really a marked overlap between the frequency of supraventricular, ventricular, and even complex arrhythmias in horses that are completely healthy and have no concerns, and racehorses that have poor performance. The one arrhythmia that we do see a clear difference is atrial fibrillation, and that's why we know that this is associated with poor performance. So the frequency of atrial fibrillation cases in the poor performance category is much higher than when we look in healthy racehorses. And then what about sudden cardiac death? So we know that in humans, complex arrhythmias like the ventricular tachycardia and even some of the couplets and triplets that we saw are associated with an increased risk of sudden cardiac death in human athletes. And we suspect that that's true in horses, but at the moment we don't know definitively, in large part because we really need an ECG to be on the horse at the time of the horse developing a potentially fatal arrhythmia, which is very hard to do. And so that's why this is an area that I'm actively involved with researching, and we'll talk about later. So I'm going to talk very briefly about a cardiac workup and what indications that there are. And as I mentioned before, diagnosing arrhythmias can be challenging, as a definitive diagnosis requires an ECG to be in place at the time of the arrhythmia. If, however, an arrhythmia is detected, in many cases a follow-up workup is indicated. And then this is also the case for horses with new heart murmurs or ones that are loud. So a grade 3 out of 6 on the left-hand side, or grade 4 out of 6 or greater on the right-hand side. And then also a cardiac workup is indicated if the horse is having some poor performance issues, especially once other causes like musculoskeletal or orthopedic and respiratory causes are ruled out. And certainly if the horse is having signs of cardiac disease. And quite often those that's what we call a diagnosis of exclusion. So we rule out other more common causes of a high heart rate or a cough. But that if you're concerned about your horse having a cardiac disease, we certainly recommend you contacting your veterinarian. And so your primary vet will be able to come out and listen to your horse's heart and may be able to do a resting ECG. This is an example of the Alive core, which we did a little study validating for use in the horse. And it's pretty cool. It's probably about three inches long with two little metal pads that you place on the horse's side. And you can see the ECG comes up on your smartphone, and this can be used to identify ECGs out in the field. And then if there are concerns, we'd recommend referral for a complete cardiac workup, which typically includes echocardiography. So this is where we use an ultrasound to image the structure of the heart to look to see if there's any structural abnormalities. We often perform exercise and post-exercise ECGs to look to see whether or not any arrhythmias are occurring at exercise, and that's important because it influences how safe we feel the horse is to be ridden. And then finally, in some cases, we place an ECG monitor for at least 24 hours to look for arrhythmias that may otherwise go undiagnosed. And for further details, please don't hesitate to contact us. So now I'm going to switch tracks a little bit and talk about the research that I'm doing about cardiac arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death in human and equine athletes. It's not hard to find news stories about apparently healthy athletes collapsing and dying during exercise. And I certainly don't need to even talk about how devastating this is for their families and everyone involved. Remarkably, sudden cardiac death is the leading medical cause of death in human athletes, and they're actually almost 4 times more likely to die of sudden cardiac death at a young age than non-athletes. And every year, about 1,000 healthy young athletes die unexpectedly during sport across the world. And this figure shows a pie chart of the results of autopsies of just under 2,000 young competitive US athletes that died between 1980 and 2006. And you can see that structural cardiac diseases such as hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and then coronary abnormalities make up almost a quarter of the young athletes that die. But there are around 28% that are either suspected to be cardiac or where no cause of death is identified. And this is where lone arrhythmias are likely to be an important cause. So the proportion of young athletes suspected to have died of sudden cardiac death, but without structural cardiac abnormalities, is remarkably consistent across studies, and it typically makes up somewhere around a third of these sudden deaths. And these cases are incredibly difficult to come to terms with as those affected literally drop down dead with no apparent cause, despite being remarkably fit. And many of these cases undergo a molecular autopsy, which is sequencing of the genes that have been shown to cause arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death in previous individuals. And this provides answers for about a third of these cases. However, the remaining 70% are left with no answers other than being thought to be genetic, but the causative variant is not identified. And what's really interesting is that these sudden cardiac death cases are very similar to horses with lone arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death, making them a potentially interesting animal model. So when we think of animal models of human disease, they really offer unique opportunities to learn about the disease of interest and improve outcomes in both species. An animal model reduces some of the challenges related to performing research in humans, and this is especially true for genetic diseases. Humans have a vast genetic diversity compared to animal species, which makes identifying the causative variant very challenging. And then finally, following variants that are thought to maybe cause disease prospectively in humans is difficult and potentially unethical. If you knew you or your child had a variant that could cause sudden cardiac death, it's highly unlikely that you would continue to take part in exercise to the level that you would have done without that variant. And this can induce huge emotional turmoil. And if it's later found that that variant is actually not having any significant effect, it can cause talented athletes to unnecessarily limit their activities. And even individuals that aren't particularly interested in athletic sport to be very aware of their heart when perhaps they don't necessarily need to be. So really, there's considerable need for an animal model of sudden cardiac death. And ideally, the model would have reduced genetic diversity compared to humans. And the horse is an excellent model from that point of view because they've been selectively bred for thousands of years, which has led to a diverse array of phenotypes, but it's also led to a quite markedly reduced genetic diversity in horse breeds compared with humans. Ideally, it would be athletic, and I've already talked about how remarkably athletic horses are. And it's also likely that it would be possible to follow horses with risk variants for arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death, whereas it is not possible in humans. And then most importantly, the model should spontaneously develop arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death with structurally normal hearts. And I've already talked about the arrhythmias that horses develop, and then we go back to another Google search. So just like in humans, it's not hard to find stories of racehorses that have died suddenly while racing, and I'm sure that you're all too familiar with this. So each week, on average, about 7 racehorses die while racing in the US alone. And of these, just under a quarter die suddenly. And this study looked at almost 300 sudden deaths from 6 racing jurisdictions around the world. And you can see about half of them had a known cause of death identified at post-mortem examination. And when we look at those, cardiac failure or cardiac pulmonary failure make up about a third of those cases. And then we have these horses where there's not a definitive cause, but there's a likely cause. And of those, almost half of them are cardiac related. And then finally, there's these unexplained horses, which make up just under a third, which is very similar to the proportion of human sudden cardiac deaths with no underlying diagnosis. And it's likely that lone arrhythmias make up a large proportion of these horses, but as I mentioned before, it's very difficult to definitively prove that. So when we're looking for a model, both humans and horses are highly athletic, of varying different ranges. Their heart rate range is more similar than that of other animal models, such as mice and rats. And they both develop naturally occurring arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death. And this is a huge advantage for the horse because there's no need to cause this disease in horses as it already occurs naturally. And then most importantly, when we think of the genetic diversity, humans have very high genetic diversity, which makes identifying causative variants challenging. Whereas in comparison, racehorses have relatively low genetic diversity, which should facilitate identification of disease-causing variants. So the long-term project goals are really to identify early markers of risk for arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death, and then utilize the horse as a spontaneous model to reduce the frequency of sudden cardiac death in both species. And I don't have time to talk about all of the objectives of the study, but I'm going to talk about the two that we've actively been working on for the last few years, which are to identify if resting ECGs can be used to predict racehorses that develop arrhythmias at exercise, And there's then also to identify variants that are associated with arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death in racehorses. So we're in the process of performing cardiac examinations, including cardiac auscultation and obtaining ECGs before, during, and after exercise in 1,000 healthy standardbred and thoroughbred racehorses. We will also perform echocardiography on as many of these horses as possible. And then at the same time, we're collecting samples from thoroughbreds with sudden cardiac death and standardbreds with atrial fibrillation. And so far, we've been doing this since the summer of 2020, which was a less than ideal time to start doing this research. But we've collected about 790 racing fit horses. When we look at the age, you can see that the standardbred horses are on have a median age that's higher than thoroughbred racehorses, which is not unexpected given the longer racing careers of standardbreds typically than thoroughbreds. And then the proportion of male to female horses is roughly equivalent to what we see in the racing population in Minnesota. This is a convenient sample, and so we work with trainers and we're able to sample the horses that are going out to training that day. There's no preference given to any horses of either sex. And then this is just a little bit of preliminary data. So on the y-axis, we have the heart rate. Sorry, I apologize. On the x-axis, we have the heart rate in beats per minute. And then on the y-axis, we have the number of horses. And then in blue, the resting heart rate or the average resting heart rate. In red, the average exercising heart rate at the peak intensity, which we've just defined as the highest heart rate that we see observed during the exercising period. And then the post-exercising heart rate is here in yellow. And one thing to point out about this, which is one of the limitations that we have with this study, is there's a very wide range of exercising heart rates. And this reflects that they're client-owned racehorses, that the trainer controls how hard the horses are worked. And so this is a limitation because in lab animals, we'd be able to get them all to a particular heart rate or exercise them all for exactly the same time. However, it's also a strength as it reflects the typical variation in exercise intensity that we see in racehorses, and we would also expect to see in human athletes as well. So for our first objective, we want to look at resting ECGs as a prediction possibility for horses that develop arrhythmias at exercise. And why do we want to do this? So full cardiac examinations before starting race training or annually would be cost prohibitive and probably unnecessary. It's certainly not something that could be done on all the racehorses that go through all the racetracks in the United States. Additionally, although exercising ECGs are used commonly in horses with suspected cardiac disease, they're not an ideal screening tool. They're time-consuming to perform and require the horse to be training and not just jogging. And then the quality can really vary. So we can see here, this is a quite nice exercising ECG with a heart rate of about 200 beats per minute. And then for whatever reason, we lose a lead, and the rest of this ECG is unreadable and not helpful for determining if that horse does develop an exercising arrhythmia or not. A few decades ago, Italy introduced a somewhat controversial pre-participation screening protocol for young athletes. So this didn't include exercising ECGs, but it included a 12-lead ECG prior to high-level exercise for human athletes. And the reduction in sudden cardiac death mortality over the 25-year period reported in the study is dramatic. It's about 90%. However, there are a couple of caveats here. And one is that there is a large number of young athletes that were not allowed to compete due to having some kind of abnormality on their ECG. And many of these have not had any problems in their life since then, and potentially were prevented from doing exercise without a really good reason. similarly, from the horse point of view, over half of these had some form of previously unrecognized structural cardiac disease, which we rarely see in horses. And so we don't know whether such a protocol will be effective in horses, and this is certainly something that we want to think about when we're developing a screening test, because we'll want to make sure that we have a good enough reliability that we can reduce the rate of sudden cardiac death, but without unnecessarily limiting the amount of exercise that certain horses could do that might not go on to have a problem. And so this is an overview of our first objective. So we will take the 8 resting ECGs of the 1,000 standardbred and thoroughbred racehorses, and then we'll utilize 2 different methods, both calculating standard ECG measurements and then also performing advanced computational analysis, which I'll explain in the next few slides. And really, we want to see if it's possible to predict which horses will go on to develop arrhythmias at exercise and which of those that will not. And as we develop this model, the long-term goal would be for us to just be able to use resting ECGs to screen horses without the need of having to do exercising ECGs. And so this will enable us to identify low-risk horses and allow them to continue and race without any continue racing without any additional intervention. In comparison, high-risk horses will undergo a cardiac workup to determine which, if any, horses are safe to continue to race. And then I'm not going to bog you down with all the details of the methods, but I wanted to briefly highlight the differences. So Dr. Freya Stein, pictured up on the right-hand side of your screens, is a PhD student that's working on developing a method to determine if it's possible just to use standard ECG measurements to differentiate between racehorses with and without arrhythmias at exercise. And this will include multiple different measurements for example, the length of the P wave, and then the length of the QT and the RR interval. And we'll use that in our prediction model. And then we have a proposal working with our collaborators, Drs. Kamalan Jeevaratnam and Celia Ma from the University of Surrey and Rossdale's Equine Hospital in the UK. And they've developed a pipeline that reads in the ECG into a computer and then converts it into a binary signal. And then using multiple different iterations of machine learning, which goes way beyond my brain power most of the time, they've been able to identify differences in resting ECGs from racehorses with a history of atrial fibrillation compared to those without. And what I want you to take away from this graph on the right-hand side is that the complexity which this is a scale of is reduced in horses that have a previous history of atrial fibrillation in comparison to controls. So this was pretty nice data that's been published over the last couple of years, and we're now in the process of developing this method for use with the more complex arrhythmias, such as the triplets and couplets, and then the more complex sustained arrhythmias. And then our next goal is to look at the genetics of arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death in racehorses. And before I'm going to talk about this too much, I'm going to give a little bit of background on what is a variant. So when we look at an individual's DNA, we always map it to a reference sequence. And the reference sequence is based on a thoroughbred mare called Twilight. And this is her sequence at the top. And then this is the sequence of the horse that we're interested in with an arrhythmia at the bottom. And you can see here that the horse that we're interested in has a G in comparison to the reference genome, which has a T. And this is an example of a single nucleotide polymorphism, which you may have heard being called a SNP. And there are many other different types of variants, but I'm just going to focus on SNPs today because I'm quite sure you don't all want to listen to an explanation of Genetics 101 at this time of night. So what we're hoping to find is that we look for variants that are in biologic candidate genes. So for example, one of the ion channel genes that are involved in the cardiac electrical activity in the heart. And then typically we want that variant to be present in the gene itself, and for it to be encoding some kind of amino acid change in the protein. And then when we look at normal horses, you can see here that the reference, which is the C, is present in almost all of the normal horses. And a few of them have a C to G, which they would be considered heterozygous for the variant, but they all appear to be normal. In comparison, when we look at horses with an arrhythmia, almost all of them have 2 copies of the G. So this would be the variant. And this is consistent with a recessive mode of inheritance. So you have to have 2 copies of the variant to cause the disease, or in this case, the arrhythmia. And then I've left this horse here because this horse does not have the 2 copies of the variant, and so is probably not developing the arrhythmia related to this variant. And it's highly likely that this horse has another variant that increases the risk of developing an arrhythmia. And the reason I left it on this slide is just to remind us all that this is a very simplified version of what's going on in the genetics, and we're really dealing with a much more complex problem, because even in horses with reduced genetic diversity, the average individual still has somewhere between 4 and 5 million variants for us to look at and try to decide which ones are important, which is why this takes more time than we hope. And so for this study, we have just over 100 thoroughbred sudden cardiac death cases, and a similar number of standardbred atrial fibrillation cases and controls. And we've developed a pipeline for prioritizing variants all the way from whole genome sequencing, which is looking at variants across every single base pair of the genome, to get down to candidate causative variants. And I have to call out Joy Stock and then Dr. Freya Stein, who are 2 of the graduate students that are working on this project, because it's quite a labor of love to go through all of these variants. So when we look at the sudden cardiac death horses, we have about 17 million variants that we're working through. And then using multiple different steps of the pipeline, our goal is to end up with about 400 variants at the end. And these will then be tested in a new population of racehorses with and without sudden cardiac death, to identify variants that are associated with arrhythmias or sudden cardiac death. And so looking at the study overview, we have atrial fibrillation and sudden cardiac death cases. And we've performed whole genome sequencing of the cases and controls. And then we will be identifying the top priority about 400 atrial fibrillation and or sudden cardiac death causing variants. At the same time, we're doing this cardiac phenotyping and looking at analysing the ECGs to identify which horses have arrhythmias at exercise and which ones don't. And this will then allow for us to genotype these variants and to test for associations between the racehorses that have problems and those that don't. And then finally, we have the computational analysis of resting ECGs. And overall, this will help us answer the questions that I talked about for our objectives of: 1, can resting ECGs differentiate between horses with and without arrhythmias at exercise? And 2, which of these variants are associated with arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death? And then when we take a step back and look at this for our long-term goals, our goal is to develop genetic and or ECG screening tests. And for horses that come up as being low risk, they will just be able to continue racing and training as normal without any additional veterinary intervention based on their risk of, based on having a very low risk of developing arrhythmias or sudden cardiac death. And then horses that have high risk will undergo increased monitoring, for example, using a cardiac workup. And then those that are found to not have arrhythmias at exercise or to be relatively low risk can continue to be raced, but with increased monitoring in between episodes of racing. And then racehorses that have problems can be targeted towards retirement and repurposing for another activity that doesn't involve such strenuous activity. And so I'm going to end with a summary. So arrhythmias are common in racehorses, and although an ECG is required for an accurate diagnosis, it's also quite tricky to identify them because you need to have the ECG on at the same time as the arrhythmia is occurring, which for some of the more the ventricular and supraventricular complexes can be really quite difficult, as the horses can lapse in and out of those arrhythmias. And be relatively normal in between. Racehorses make an excellent model for human arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death. And our short-term goal is to identify risk factors for arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death in racehorses. And then with a long-term goal will be to use genetics and ECGs to reduce the risk of sudden cardiac death in horses and in humans. And then finally, I just want to thank everyone that's involved in this project. It's a really big project, and there's been I've had a lot of help from my mentors, our co-investigators and collaborators and students. And then this work really couldn't be done without the racing authorities helping to facilitate this racehorse data collection, as well as the owners, trainers, grooms, and jockeys. And then I also have to thank all of the funding agencies that have contributed to this. It's quite expensive when you do a project of this size, but it's necessary to help us find hopefully some answers over the next few years. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for listening to me on a Tuesday evening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Durward-Akhurst. That was a wonderful presentation. Amazing work going on. So now we'll begin the Q&A, and we'll dive in with some of the pre-submitted questions. One came in from a guest asking, are there any tips for a general practitioner when ultrasounding the heart, looking for similar issues?
So this is a really good question, and the honest answer is not really, because the probe that you need is very specialized. To get a really good image of an adult horse's heart, you need somewhere between 30 and 35 centimeters of depth, which most probes won't easily do. That being said, if you're looking at the heart because you're concerned that maybe there's some pericardial effusion or something that's, you just need to have a quick look just to check what's going on. An abdominal ultrasound probe is definitely a possibility just for a quick spot check. But if you think the horse needs a full echocardiogram, I'd highly recommend bringing them into our cardiology team.
Great, thank you. Another guest asked, are there wearable 24-hour Wi-Fi heart monitors available for horses?
Yes, so I talked a little bit about that a little bit. So the Televet is the one that we use for our horses, and that just fits on kind of under a surcingle, and can stay in place for really as long as you'd like it to stay on. The burden with that is the analysis. So, if you review 24 hours, you've got to read 24 hours of ECG, which takes a lot of time. There are now human devices that are little patch stick-on devices that will stay in place for somewhere between a week and 2 weeks. And those are incredibly useful. And we have had some success with using the human software to analyze ECG data. And so for those ones, I watch this space. I'm pretty excited about where we go with those.
That's great. Thank you. Another question here is arrhythmia due to genetic conditions, as you spoke on? Is it more common in aging horses, or can it occur in younger horses?
So it really depends on the underlying thing. So we know that sudden cardiac death is actually more common in young racehorses than it is in old racehorses. So there's a recent study out of Australia that's demonstrated that 2-year-olds, 2 and 3-year-olds were at highest risk of developing sudden cardiac death. which certainly does fit with probably some kind of genetic etiology. But older horses can get arrhythmias too, and that's in part because they have other problems going on. So they might have some kind of metabolic syndrome going on or something else that increases their risk of developing arrhythmias. And in those cases, it may be less likely to be genetic.
Now we're going on to some questions that came in this evening. Looks like we just have one here so far, so we do welcome more questions. This question asks, the person is saying they have heard of, quote, heart horses, end quote, that would have a pattern of winning races once or twice before then placing last and then repeating. Have you heard of this performance issue before and what irregularity this could be associated with?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's actually something that we're actively looking at as well. So we're in the process of seeing if we can get racing data on these horses to see whether or not horses that we pick up as having exercising arrhythmias have a previous history of having really good and really bad performance. And that is certainly something that I've heard anecdotally and perhaps even seen. A few of the horses that we've seen that have had problems have had this career where they're either outstanding or they're terrible. And, you know, could it be on those days that they're terrible that they're having some form of an arrhythmia and just cannot run as fast? Because when you think of the horse, they are truly magnificent athletes, but they need their heart to be functioning at maximal capacity because otherwise they're just not able to run. And so quite often we'll see if a horse does have a problem, there's many different reasons. It's not just the heart. But for me, what I don't want to see, but what I sometimes expect to see is that the horse is running really well, and then all of a sudden it just doesn't run and it stops running as well. And there are various upper airway things that it can be as well, but some kind of cardiac issue is where I would think about that as well.
Thank you. Another person is saying, first, thank you so much for such important work. And then their question is, are you using AI at all to help sort through all of this data, the volume of data?
So that's a really good question as well. And it's something that I can't believe that I'm even thinking about doing. So a lot of what we do doesn't necessarily use specific AI, but I do now use it to help me with issues that I have with coding. And so when I'm running into something that I just can't fix because I am not a classically trained computational biologist, I use ChatGPT for that. And it's certainly something that we're training models to learn whether they can predict whether these horses will have problems or not. And so one day, one day we may get more onto the AI level of, but we're not quite there yet. But I am certainly open to discussing it more because I think there probably are opportunities there.
Great. Thanks. We have another question. I think you did touch on this in your presentation, but someone did ask again about the difference between a murmur and an arrhythmia.
So that's a good question, and I didn't really have time to talk about both, so I apologize about that. But an arrhythmia is where you have an irregular where so you should have a very regular heartbeat, and it shouldn't really change that much. An arrhythmia is where it's not regular. So rather than having something like lub dub lub dub lub dub, you might have lub dub lub dub lub dub lub dub, and so there's a difference. In comparison, a murmur is when there's turbulent flow through some part of the heart. So most commonly that's related to turbulent flow in one of the valves. And so one of the most common murmurs that we listen to in older horses is aortic regurgitation, which is where the aortic valve, which stops blood coming back from the body when it goes out of the ventricle, is leaky. And what you would hear with a murmur is a noise in between the lub and the dub sound. So for aortic regurgitation, you might hear lub dub shh, lub dub shh. So it would happen at a very regular interval, but there would be a noise in between the two of them. And I could talk for a while about what the lub-dub sounds are, which is the closure of the valves, but there should really be pretty much silence in between the two of them. And if there's noise, that's what we would call a murmur.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Someone has asked now, if a horse is diagnosed with a murmur, what is the risk to continue with exercise or training?
So that's a good question, and I can't give you a straight answer because it depends. So it really depends on what the cause of the murmur is. So murmurs are actually pretty common in fit and healthy young horses. Somewhere in the region of about 20% of completely healthy thoroughbreds have some kind of murmur, which is um, really quite surprising. And really, they're flow murmurs. So there's just turbulent flow. There's not actually anything wrong with the underlying structure of the heart that we can tell, at least on ultrasound anyway. But most often what we say is, to know for sure that the horse is fit and safe to ride, is to have an echocardiogram done. If there's no abnormalities on echo, then we may not need to do any other additional diagnostics. But if there are abnormalities on the echo, then we would probably want to do an ECG as well. And the reason behind that is quite often when you have leakiness of a valve, eventually it can lead to enlargement of one of the heart chambers. So an example that we see is in some cases if we have the mitral valve, which is in between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And if you get leakiness of that valve and there's enough leakiness, eventually the left atrium will start to become bigger. And the bigger the left atrium is, the more likely you are to get atrial fibrillation. And so that would be a reason for us to do an ECG as well, to determine whether or not the horse is safe to be ridden.
Great, thanks. I'll let folks take a minute to think of any final questions, but one I actually had just listening to the presentation is zooming out for any owners who are not having done any diagnostics or any initial screenings. What are some physical symptoms or signs that might indicate the presence of an arrhythmia? If someone is suspecting that there may be something that they would like to look into for their horse.
So the most common sign is probably some kind of poor performance. And one of the things about the horses being really amazing athletes is that they actually have really huge cardiovascular reserves when they're not being asked to race at maximal intensity. So we can see, so atrial fibrillation is a great example. We know in racehorses it causes poor performance. The horses don't run as fast, or they chronically have problems. They might be like those heart horses where they run really well one day and not run the other. But actually, horses with atrial fibrillation can, after they've had a cardiac workup, be used in lower level hacking, trail riding and things like that without a problem, because they're never asked to use their heart in such high intensity levels that they would need to use all of their heart capacity. So it can actually be really difficult to find to know that your horse has a problem. So typically, if and when your vet does vaccinations, they might listen to the heart, and that might be a time when they pick up that their horse has got an arrhythmia. But otherwise, if you're just finding that your horse just doesn't have the energy that they used to have, and there doesn't seem to be a lameness, or they're not coughing more, those are usually some of the first signs that you see of a heart issue. It's quite rare, fortunately, for horses to have congestive heart failure, and those horses are usually relatively sick, so they usually do have a cough. They have quite a high heart rate, sometimes a high respiratory rate, and then the jugular vein, which runs down their necks, you quite often, when their head is held up, you'll see a pulse reach all the way from the sort of groove at the bottom all the way up to the top. And that's a pretty important sign to pick up on, because that's suggestive of really significant heart disease. But don't panic if your horse's head is low. Your horse's head needs to be held up before you worry about it.